All right, everyone. Welcome back. Let's get this party started. So, if you remember last time, we had ended by talking about de-extinction and some of the, challenges, moral, political, and so on, when it comes to some of these scientific advancements. Next week, when we talk about science and technology, we'll talk more specifically about the role of ethics and science and so on. But already, in terms of combating environmental devastation and species loss, there's already a movement afoot to begin using DNA to bring back species that are going extinct or have recently been extinct. Again, as I said, there's a lot of debate around this. So, looking at another aspect of environmental sociology where sociologists provided a lot of input that I think had been missing before then, is this concept of disproportionality. So the idea here is that most environmental harm comes from a few criminal or negligent actors. What does that mean? Well, one of my mentors, the environmental sociologist Bill Freudenberg, had been doing research on environmental sociology for decades, and into about maybe the fourth or fifth decade of doing this research, he started to notice a pattern that when they were looking at polluting industries, they would often find that there was a disproportionality in terms of the pollution. So it wouldn't be necessarily just that everyone in the energy sector, pollutes the same amount. Excuse me. Rather, you find that sometimes it's one company that's polluting disproportionately more, or sometimes even it's just one single facility, one power plant, for instance, that captures a lot of the pollution, or that is responsible for a lot of the pollution. So this is an extremely important idea because the environmental movement, for the most part, focuses on things that individuals can do. For some reason this isn't showing all the way, but it says 12 ways that you can act to save Mother Earth. 50 simple things kids can do, top 10 ways to save the earth, etc. These are all individual things that you can do. Now, obviously, it's important to, say, recycle pop cans in the United States, 300 million times. Anything is a big number, pretty much. Nevertheless, there's some problems with this individual focus, which the environmental movement had generally focused on individual behavior and things necessary to change that. There's some drawbacks, though, to this individual focus. One is that it makes these problems seem bigger and harder to solve. When you look at the statistics sometimes in terms of how much plastic is being thrown away, how much plastic we consume, and so on, sometimes it may overwhelm us and just think, well, there's nothing we can do. What does it matter if I just throw this plastic bottle away as opposed to throwing it in the recycling bin? So that's one problem with this. The other is it leads to environmental elitism. So I mentioned I got my PhD in Santa Barbara, California. If you're familiar with that place, it had an oil spill in the 1960s, which helped lead to Earth Day. And so they take Earth Day very seriously there. And there's a lot of biking and so on. And there's also a lot of environmental elitism where people, kind of feel elitist about how well they're treating the environment, how often they ride bikes as opposed to drive their cars, that sort of thing. So individual focus can can lead to also a sort of elitist behavior. Oftentimes there's a correlation there with class. Other things is that we don't always consider when we look at things from an individual perspective. There is a scientist who looked at a quarter pounder, a McDonald's quarter pounder, and all the energy and everything that goes into it. And you can look at the numbers there. I'm not going to go through it all, but basically one quarter pounder requires 3,000 gallons of water. An incredible amount. Now, here's where we sort of draw the link then. That quarter pounder comes together somehow. How is that brought together? I'll explain in a moment. Just other problem with this individual focus is that basic. Whoops, I'm sorry. Basically it misses a lot of the problems because they seem so big. As I said, the water consumed by the average American per day, there's a certain amount that we use as liquid. Then there's also, the water that goes into the food that we eat. And that's actually where a lot of the water in our consumption ends up going. So Freudenberg, that environmental sociologist I mentioned, he had looked at individual consumers, and then he contrasts that with what he called the organized producers. And this is primarily companies, governments, that sort of thing. Large organizations that have a lot more power than individuals do. I think the best example of disproportionality comes from this examination of electricity plants in the United States. So there's about 6,000 of them. About 30% of all power sector carbon emissions in 2011 came from the 50 dirtiest plants. So 30% of all the bad stuff is coming from just 50 plants. 50% of all the bad stuff is coming from the 100 dirtiest plants. 90%, so, almost the total amount of, carbon dioxide emissions in the United States comes from the dirtiest 500 plants. That means that you have 5,500 facilities that are responsible for only 10% of carbon dioxide emissions. So what this means is, say you're a government and you're trying to figure out how to reduce emissions, reduce pollution in the air, that sort of thing. You could try to develop some blanket regulations for all 6,000 of these power plants, or perhaps you could develop some more targeted regulations or focuses on some of these, these 50% of, these 100 plants that, are responsible for 50% of the pollution. Or, if you didn't even have that many resources, you could look at the 50 dirtiest plants and, if you could clean them up a bit, you could make a huge dent in terms of the overall emissions that are being put into the atmosphere. Now, when we look at this, what is the reason for this? Why are some emitting so much more than others? Sometimes it just comes down to size, for example. A power plant that is powering, say, the city of Pittsburgh is going to, emit more carbon dioxide than a power plant that's powering State College or something like this. So in some cases, you just have bigger facilities, and bigger facilities, just by the nature of their operations, are emitting more than the average, or during more than the rest of the power plants. Other times when they've done research, though, they've often found that it's just negligence. There's been some research, for example, on toxic chemicals. So this is another area that the disproportionality folk have spent a lot of time on. And so again, they find that, 50% of, harmful toxins come from less than 4% of facilities. That's not, we're not talking about companies or sectors here. We're talking about individual facilities, power plants, essentially, or chemical processing plants. And so they did research, and they found that basically 95% of the facilities produce those same chemicals with significantly less pollution. And, they kind of looked at some individual companies, and, in one instance, they found that a lot of the pollution was coming from, I believe it was what was it? What did they have? Some sort of fertilizer, I believe, and they had it piled up outside, and it turned out if you actually covered it up, then it would not evaporate into the atmosphere and so on, and it actually ended up saving the company a lot of money and resources, and they ended up coming out financially on top of it. So again, that relationship between the environment and the economy is much more complicated than one versus the other. It's one and the other. It's just kind of how you decide to make that determination. So disproportionality research is, taking off. There's more and more studies that are adopting this. In the 2000s, there's a study done that found that, only 5% of total vehicles in the United States are responsible for, almost half of the emissions. So again, if you're targeting air pollution, maybe target and air pollution coming from automobiles, maybe look at those vehicles that are causing the most harm. Maybe you can regulate those more than others. It just kind of depends. The whole point is, excuse me, in Freudenberg. Actually, let me back up a bit. Freudenberg's point when he was doing this research was that, these environmental problems require probably some targeted, precise solutions. Now, a lot of Marxists didn't like to hear this. They tend to blame capitalism itself. And they will argue that, just because you were to clean up a few of these power plants is not going to stop the consumption, the drive for consumption that the treadmill has us on, that treadmill of production. And they argue that, you have to change the economic system and for there to be real change. That may or may not be the case. Freudenberg's argument is that, well, whether that is the case or not, you can make some immediate, fairly immediate, changes that are going to have impact by maybe targeting some of these industries a bit more closely than others. Now, something to think about, I'm not going to read all of this to you, but, this is something to discuss on Packback perhaps. Plastic shopping bags. Now, plastics require, why are plastics bad? Where does plastic come from? Plastics come from oil, they come from petroleum. So, the oil industry does not want us to start using cloth bags and so on. So we know that they can stay in the atmosphere for, decades, if not centuries. There's more and more research being done, finding plastics, in all corners, not corners of the earth. That sounds like a flat earther or something. Basically, around the globe, you can find, plastic particles really everywhere. They're finding it in Antarctica, in the Arctic. Huge levels of plastics in the Great Lakes. As I moved from California to here, started to learn about the environment around us, and one of the things that's been striking is the number of microplastics that they're finding in the Great Lakes that are coming from actually from a lot of shampoos and a lot of things soaps and stuff like that that we use to clean ourselves. So anyway, going back to plastic bags, one pitch for using cloth bags: you don't have to take as many trips to the grocery. Take as many trips to the car. You can fit more in some of those cloth bags. Started using those actually a number of years ago. California, a number of years ago, became the first state to ban plastic bags. You've seen other states follow, other cities have followed as well. You can think about it. What would you support? A no ban on the plastic bags, a ban, or just a tax? I'll just leave that up to you. Some food for thought there. When we talk about disproportionality, just go here, disproportionality, have that word up there. I have a colleague named Mary Collins, and she studied under Freudenberg. We both studied under him. And she did one of the biggest studies that has been done on this topic. She looked at all polluting facilities in the United States. She hired some MIT computer scientists to work for her, crashed their computers because she had so much data. But she was basically testing this. She was looking at, is there a disproportionate amount of energy or of pollution being released from a small number of facilities? And perhaps no surprise, she found that yes, that's, we find it pretty universally almost, that there's huge places that are polluting more than others. Not only that, she also overlaid where these polluting facilities were located. And that's where it gets particularly interesting from a sociological perspective. And it leads us to discussing environmental racism and also the concept of environmental justice, which I will return to in 1 second. I do want to just talk about these different perspectives in sociology. The conflict perspective is where environmental justice falls, so that's why we're here now. So the functionalist perspective, remember, functionalists, they look at societies kind of like ecosystems in the first place. So when they look at environmental issues, the society environmental interface, they look at it systemically and try to understand, okay, what are those sort of areas that we need to function in the broader environment, in the natural environment? What do we need to function so that our society functions? And how does our society function based upon our interaction with the environment? What sort of dysfunctions are caused in our society by environmental problems, and so on. Conflict theorists and people with a conflict perspective, remember, they're looking at inequalities that are causing some of these problems. So they're often interested in who are the polluters? Are they powerful? Do they have more access to government? Are they the government? And things like this. So they're interested in these power differentials. And in sort of the modern world, they're critiquing capitalism because it's the dominant system. But as we know from history, the Soviet Union and China, communist China, have their economic plans have really done a lot of damage to the environment. Capitalism, because it's based on constant growth, also tends to require this. However, as we talked about, there are ways of mitigating it, such as ecological modernization, industrial ecology, and things like that we discussed a little bit. So, as I said, the conflict perspective also brings us to a discussion of environmental racism. So this is environmental policies that have a disproportionately bad impact on usually individuals or groups based upon their race or color. Oftentimes low-income people are often hit hard as well. I just want to go back to the slides. We have just a visual image here when I'm talking about this. So back in the 1980s, a sociologist named Robert Bullard, an African-American sociologist, wrote this book called Dumping in Dixie. And he had noticed that a lot of companies, municipalities were dumping their waste in poor black neighborhoods in the South. And so he did a study on that, published it, and that sort of generated a lot of interest in this topic. And pretty soon you had a number of studies, documenting this in all sorts of areas, not only trash being dumped, but where companies would locate facilities, and whether they would locate them in a predominantly white neighborhood, in a predominantly black neighborhood, and so on. So this, became known as environmental justice, and you also saw for, it's probably about a decade maybe, you had this sort of statistical warring battle between two camps that were looking at this issue. On the one hand, there were a group of statisticians who were saying it probably has more to do with income than race. That, this 1980s, 90s that they're looking, and, poverty correlates high with race, with, people of color, neighborhoods with people of color. So it's probably poverty, low property values. That's why, trash incinerators and power plants and so on are being located in these places. Another researcher named Paul Mohai a statistician, was also looking, and he was saying, no, I'm looking at this data, and it looks like race matters more than income level, poverty, and so on. Then a few years later, someone was doing some journalist, I think, was doing a story on this debate, and they contacted this guy Anderton, who had been the statistician arguing that it was poverty and not race. And, they asked him, what he thought about whether it was poverty or race. And he said, well, actually, the person with the best data on this that you should talk to is Paul Mohai, who is the sociologist he had been, sort of competing with or arguing against for the better part of a decade. And so that, in some ways, was sort of a concession, saying, actually, it appears that it's race more than class and wealth level. So, just examples of this would be places where companies had the option of locating a facility in a middle-class black neighborhood or a poor white neighborhood, and they chose the middle-class black neighborhood. You can think about it in terms of I believe the Keystone Pipeline, the famous pipeline project going from Canada through the Dakotas. Initially was going through a wealthier or whiter neighborhood, at least in Bismarck, North Dakota. Then they moved it to go through the Native American reservation, and that's what sparked the protests. Notice you didn't hear about the Bismarck people protesting. It was done more quietly. It was, they had more power, that sort of thing. So anyway, interesting aspect there. So anyway, my colleague Mary Collins, who, as I mentioned earlier, had looked at these facilities and found, that they were disproportionately causing more pollution and so on. And then she put them on a map and found that they were primarily in not only poor neighborhoods, but overwhelmingly neighborhoods with people of color. So this is a huge topic, and I think I do get. Yeah, we return to it in a little bit. This is, so I'll wait to go into more detail shortly, but this is huge for obvious reasons, human health being the big one. As I said, we'll get there. Okay, functionalism, conflict, talk about that. Okay, just sort of a history of the environmental movement. You can look at this on your own time in the slides, in the modules. I think it's important to know that, we generally date the start of the environmental movement to the late 1950s, early 1960s. And you get a whole bunch of, major environmental legislation that happens in the early 1970s. A lot of major organizations are started at this time, and then you start to get a number of treaties that are signed in the 1980s. And as we move forward, it starts to become unclear exactly what's going to happen. Okay, this is in the Canvas modules. In case you're interested, you can take this little. It says quiz. It's just a little activity that basically asks, how, do you live in a house or an apartment? Do you take a bus or do you drive a car? You fill out all these things and basically says how many Earths would be needed to provide everyone on the planet if they lived at the same, consumed at the same rate that you do. So anyway, that's in the modules with, I believe it, I think it's with the videos. If it's not there yet, it will be. So anyway, it's short, but it is kind of eye-opening in terms of, gives you some idea in terms of your environmental use and how it compares to others. Okay, as I said, early 1900s, already there's a lot of the natural environment that's been despoiled in the United States. And I think it was especially as people began to move west and see, some of the really tremendous sites like the redwoods and stuff like that, where you really started to see a number of people argue for their protection, that, there's something intrinsic in the environment itself that needs, that requires protection. And I should say that, the environment is often, at least in the United States, thought of as being sort of a liberal issue, an issue on the political left, but it really shouldn't be. I mean, conservation, as the famous conservative scholar Roger Scruton said, conservation has the word conserve in it, or conservative has the word conserve in it. And so there's arguments for a conservative environmentalism, which I think is needed, because I'm not sure if liberals have all the answers to our environmental problems. So if you are, interested in sort of what would a conservative approach to environmental issues look like, Roger Scruton lays it out here. Long story short, rather than relying upon large governmental regulations, he believes there should be more voluntary associations and things like that, which we will talk about in a future class. Okay. Other major figure in the birth of the environmental movement, Rachel Carson, wrote a book called Silent Spring, did a number of studies on water pollution, and really basically kind of recognized, was basically the whistleblower when it came to the pesticide industry, and, pointed out that, unless we did something soon, the pesticides would poison our waterways to the point where we would not be able to use them at all. So the number of people, many of us, would be negatively affected by a whole range of chemicals. House cleaning products in particular, I would use like vinegar and water. I mean, vinegar, it may not have the greatest smell if you don't like the smell of vinegar, but it actually is quite powerful. Not nearly as deadly for you as some of these chemicals. Colognes and perfumes is always something that I always find interesting. A lot of these are high and dangerous chemicals, and I have a feeling that, in decades from now, humans of the future may look back and wonder why we were dousing ourselves in these dangerous chemicals to prevent us from smelling like ourselves. Anyway, so there is this multiple chemical sensitivity, the MCS, this environmental illness, meaning, that you have some sort of physical reaction to these different chemicals. Oops, got that in there twice. So, importantly for understanding the environmental movement and how humans address the environmental movement in the United States and really globally has focused primarily on government action and government treaties. And, that is an obvious route to go. I mean, I think that makes the most sense. Initially, They're the ones who can pass laws, legislation, or if we want to talk about ecological modernization, they can offer incentives to companies that are, making solar panels or something like this, and so on. One of my concerns with this approach is that it presupposes the nation state as a stable entity that is capable of enacting these regulations and enforcing them. Nation states, some argue, have been sort of hollowed out over the years as private companies and nonprofit organizations have started to take on more responsibility. However, as I said, we still see government as the main area in which a lot of important environmental work is done. In the late 1960s and early 70s, you actually had a fairly bipartisan approach to the environment. Out west, you had a number of conservative governors, mayors, city council people, and so on, who were worried about cities growing, encroaching upon agriculture land. People in Oregon and Washington were worried about becoming the next California, a bunch of, kind of unconstrained urban development and so on. And so you saw a lot of pressure that was exerted on politicians, liberal, conservative, and so on. And this led to a slew of different regulations, major environmental laws. I'll let you look at these slides on your own. The Clean Air Act, major one, has prevented many deaths. Has made the air quality much better than it would be otherwise. I lived in California for a while, and if you look at pictures of Los Angeles in the 1950s or 60s, it looks pretty dirty. I mean, there's definitely a brown haze in the air. You still see a haze in the air in the San Gabriel Valley in Los Angeles, but not nearly to the same extent that you would see in those old pictures. You don't need to write all this down, but just these numbers are there for your own interest. The Clean Water Act was passed in the early 1970s. This basically made sure that most water was safe for swimming or fishing. And this, the Clean Water Act has tried to help with saving wetlands. Wetlands, it turned out, are extremely important for reducing floods. So Hurricane Katrina that hit New Orleans, it went through what had been a mangrove forest, which usually would absorb water from hurricanes. But since that wasn't there, all the water just went straight to the city. Similarly with Houston. Houston, built over a lot of swamps and wetlands. The problem then is that you've just got cement and the water just goes right across it. So we see that this has happened to a lot of wetlands. But most waterways in the United States are fairly safe in terms of, if you get water from the faucet, you're probably going to get clean water. Now, this is a chart looking at number of waterways, number of rivers, waterways impaired by state. Look what state there is bright red. Pennsylvania. As I said, Pennsylvania is one of the more polluted states in the nation. Also, it has more waterways than most other states, so it's not fair to, compare Pennsylvania to, say, Nevada or something like this. Nevertheless, if you look at Pennsylvania's pollution levels, at the county level, I think I talked about this last time, it's higher than a lot of other places in the country. Why is that? Well, Pennsylvania is an industrial state. and it developed as an industrial state. So you just have had a lot of polluting industry here. So I think that's that's the main reason why you see more pollution in Pennsylvania than elsewhere. Also, it's the eighth most populated state, so it does have a lot of people in it. So that's also another reason. So we talked about de-extinction using DNA to bring back species and so on. But before doing that, we have to keep animals alive. So one of the key ways in which that has been done is the Endangered Species Act. Since 1973, this has protected scores of animals. So as I said, there's been a number of legislation that was passed in the 60s and 70s. Again, these are laws that were primarily focused on sort of the wilderness, not the Clean Air and Water Act as much, but especially these that dealt with the endangered species, with wetlands, and so on and so forth. Now, to sort of return to environmental racism, Robert Bullard used to go give talks to African American communities and high schools, and would ask if people cared about the environment, and these were usually in cities, and not very many people would raise their hands, and he would be like, how many of you need water? Everyone raised their hands. How many of you need air? Everyone raises their hands. And then he would go into his discussion of environmental racism. What I was saying was that, yes, my friend who did that huge study of disproportionality also found a lot of environmental injustice. These facilities were located in African American neighborhoods. Here you can see these transfer stations for trash, for solid waste. And this is looking at percentages where, the darker is larger percentage of the population in that tract is are people of color. Over here, basically the lighter you get, the more money that you have there. So you see some places where it's clear that there's poorer areas where they're located, but you also see a number of them located in places that are not necessarily that have high median household incomes, but are predominantly people of color. This is one of my favorite maps. It's from 1996, but it actually still holds fairly true today. Looking at Los Angeles, the green dots there are toxic release facilities, and then the color is percentage of people in color. So the yellow, which is a lot of it here, those are 0 to 40% people living in color. The red, by contrast, are areas where 80 to 100% of the people living there are people of color. And you can see where the toxic release facilities are located, and where people of color are living. So you can look at other maps and see something similar. Some of you may be more familiar with Washington, D.C. and the D.C. area. So over here, again, the darker areas are percent black. So, the darkest green is 86 to 100% black. The next darkest shade of green, like the shade I believe here, is about 67% to 85%, and so on. So again, you can see that some power plants and toxic waste sites and so on, sewage treatment facilities, almost all located where you have larger black populations. So as I said, we generally refer to this as environmental racism, environmental injustice. The environmental justice movement tries to address some of these issues, tries to tries to focus on ways to give these communities, more say in terms of, what gets built in their neighborhoods. So remember we talked about Stuart Brand. He had written that whole Earth catalog back in the 1960s. His more recent book, Whole Earth Discipline, is controversial. He argues in favor of nuclear power and de-extinction. Geoengineering, I don't know if I mentioned that, I think a little bit in the video that we watched. Geoengineering is an idea that basically, if you were to put certain chemicals up into the atmosphere, they would counteract the carbon dioxide emissions. And if you could do that, then you could, cool the earth a bit. Mentioned Mount Pinatubo. When it became a volcano and shot all the sulfur into the atmosphere, it cooled the earth by, I believe, about 1 degree for a couple of years, and that actually led to a bumper crop of polar bear cubs that year. And so those polar bear cubs that were born that year are called the Pinatubo cubs because it led to the cooling of the atmosphere, and so the Arctic Circle was more frozen than it would have been otherwise. So the idea with geoengineering is that maybe we could do something similar using technology. And then the show and movie Snowpiercer, if you've seen them, are about what if you did that wrong and basically turned the whole world into like a Siberian tundra or something like that. So anyway, things could go wrong. Whoops, got these in there a couple of times. Interaction is perspective. So these would study how we define environmental problems. How we think about population, for example. The terms we use to try and, get the message across, that sort of thing. So the interaction is perspective, I think, has been very important for environmental scientists and environmental activists to consider, thinking about how we develop meaning. As I said, for a long time, when people thought about the environment, they're thinking about the trees out there, the forest that's outside of town. Whereas now we're thinking about, the water that's flowing through our tap, the food in our refrigerator, that sort of thing. So I think we're going through this shift where we're starting to have a greater understanding of these different perspectives. Because one thing that many companies do is that they'll say they're better for the environment than they actually are. Or they'll go through some motions, to clean themselves up, but maybe won't actually do it. So the company British Petroleum, this has been the evolution of their logo over time. 2000, they adopted this sort of sun-looking thing, and they changed their name from British Petroleum to Beyond Petroleum. Now, there's a problem. They have not gone beyond petroleum yet. They're not even close. They're still well within petroleum. But this is what we would call greenwashing, where companies they say they're beyond petroleum, but they're still drilling and sucking up a lot of petroleum. Now, this is something we'll talk about too when we talk about war and terrorism. Environmental migrants, and this is a problem that will grow, and we already have this happening in the world and causing conflicts, but it happens through a lot of indirect processes. A lot of conflicts in Africa that I studied were the result of, well, not purely the result, but were partly caused by environmental refugees leaving situations of drought and things like that. But more and more people are being displaced from environmental disasters, and we're seeing this on the west coast of the U.S. with the huge fires and so on. This then also leads to some questions about, you know, immigration policies and the environment. How do we manage migration and save the environment at the same time? It's not a clear question, and unfortunately, as we know, people can get into conflict over resources. So we would like to avoid that as much as possible. But I think understanding the environment and understanding all of these things helps us and can help us, prevent conflicts over resources in the future. Okay, so I think that's a good place to stop. Next week, we'll be talking about science and technology. A lot to talk about there. And then following that, we'll be talking about war and terrorism. So, these problems keep on growing. So, all right, have a good weekend, everyone.